Okay, grade 8. This is a 18 for, which means there are 9 questions from the test that you're going to write, plus there are 9 questions from Reachback, previously learned material. So the first 9 questions we have here are all from probability. If you want to try these again, just press pause and give her a go and see how well you do, and then I press unpause to see if your answer was correct. So your first question asks you, what is the P bracket H11? This P stands for probability. This H stands for heads. These 1 stand for 1, which means this is the first, second, and third event. First, second, and third. So the probability of heads in that first coin is 1 chance out of 2. The probability of a 1 on the second spinner would be 2 chances out of 3. And the probability of 1 on this third spinner here would be 3 chances out of 4. And what we learned is in grade 8, if you take the probabilities of each independent event and multiply them together, that would be the theoretical probability of that event happening, the combined probability. So 1 times 2 is 2, and 2 times 3 is 6. 6 times 4 is 24, so you have 6 out of 24. If I reduce that to lowest terms, I might be able to figure it out as a percentage without having to go to a calculator, and I can. So the probability of that event happening, a heads, a 1, and a 1, is only 25%. If we look at the second question of probability, it says, what's the probability of rolling or flipping heads 8 times in a row? So theoretical probability would be the first event is heads, would be 1 chance out of 2, and then each one of these would also be an additional 1 chance out of 2. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. One more. There's 8 of them. So if you multiply the numerators, 1 times 1. Now, a lot of people multiply the numerators and get 8. 1 times itself 8 times would be 8, but that's not true. 1 times itself 8 times is 1, and 2 multiplied by itself 8 times. Now, you could take a calculator. For some of you who have a calculator. And you could go 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, etc. But that's kind of a waste of time. Over here, we have a button that says XY. Now, what that button means is if I put 2 and then press that XY button, that's basically saying what my base is. Now, whatever my next button is, that's going to call the Y, is going to be my exponent. And then when I press the equals button, it's going to do 2 to the exponent 8, which is 2 multiplied by itself 8 times. All right, and the answer is 256. Now, some of you might not have that button. So if you look at the calculator again, if I go 2 and then press that XY button, see up here you have this little arrow pointing up. Some of you might have that. And that's actually just like it's like pushing the number up to here as if it was an exponent. So if you have that button, it's the same thing as that XY button. You can use that. But the answer is 1 chance out of 256, which I want to change it to a percentage. 1 divided by 256 is 0.004-ish, or approximately 0.4%. Your next question has 2 bags. It says, what's the probability of a red from the first bag and a blue from the second bag? Well, there are 6 marbles, I suppose, in that bag, and there are 5 in this bag. So in that first bag, how many of them are red? There are 5 out of 6 that are red. And for blue, in that second bag, there are 2 out of 5 that are blue. So the combined probability would be the product of those two, which is 10 over 30, which is 33 decimal 3 repeating, or 33.33% probability. The next question is one that most people get wrong. It says there's a 60% chance of rain at position A, or city A. And there's an 80% chance of rain at city B. What's the probability that it will rain in both A and B? So if we think about 60%, 60% is really 60%, or 60 out of 100. 80% is really 0.8, or 80 out of 100. So if I was to multiply these two or multiply these two, I would be able to get the combined probability. So 60 times 80, I'm just going to do 6 times 8, which is 48. And then I'm going to add my 2 zeros. So it's 4,800. 100 times 100, I'm going to do 1 times 1, which is 1. And then add my 4 zeros. And I have 4,800 over 10,000. Now I'm going to make this into an equivalent fraction over 100, because that's what percentages are. So we move the decimal here twice, or divide by 100. I could divide there, and I would have 48 out of 100, which is 48%. Now conversely, because decimal 6 and decimal 8 are really what the decimal versions of those percentages are, if I go decimal 6 times decimal 8, I also get 0.48, which is still 48%. A lot of people think that it would be 70% because they're thinking the average of those two would be the answer, but it's not. It's actually 48% probability. Your next question says probability of what would be 4 to 16 and 25%. And you're even given the table here. So we see that there's check marks in these spaces here, which means the probability of rolling a 2 and a 1 together in any order, or a probability of a sum of 3, or the probability of a 1 or a 2 in either order would be two acceptable answers for what that was. Or the probability, you could also say probability of a product of 2. That would also work. Various answers you can have there that are true. Next question says the class has 10 girls and 15 boys. How many combos for dates are there? Well, if you think about the boys, so one of these boys, his name is Liam. Now, Liam can have 10 dates. And then there's Joe, and Joe can have 10 dates. And so on and so forth. So every boy, all 15 boys have a potential to go out with 10 girls, which means, if we think about it as 10 girls multiplied by the number of boys, means there's 150 possible combinations, or that's the number of possible dates there would be. And then the second part says, if one boy and one girl are brother and sister, what's the probability that they're matched together? Some people are like, oh, that's gross, but they obviously wouldn't date. They'd just be like, I am not going out with my brother. That's crazy. If you multiply them out, though, there's only one possible combination out of the 150 that are possible where they'd have the brother and sister being chose to matched up. What is the difference between experimental and theoretical probability? Well, experimental probability is where you take an event, like, for example, flipping a coin. And I did this in class once. I took 4 coins. I took 4 $1 coins. And I flipped all 4. And I said, before I did it, I said, what's the theoretical probability that it's going to be all heads? And we calculated that each of them has 1 chance out of 2 to land on heads. So the theoretical probability was, if I was to flip those coins 16 times, it should, on average, happen 1 time out of every 16. But when I did it, on the very first time it happened, it went heads, 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 heads. And people were like, well, isn't that 100% probability? I said, no. If I was to do this 1,000,000 times, on average, it would happen 1 chance out of every 16. Because my experimental probability happened on the first one, doesn't mean that that's the probability. It just means that over the long haul, if I was to do it many times, I would get closer to my theoretical probability the more experimental probabilities I did. So if I was to do one of them and it happened, it doesn't mean that it's 100% chance, but if I was to do 1,000 times, I'd probably get pretty darn close to 1 out of every 16 times was heads. Next one says P equals what over what? Well, the formula for probability is probability equals favorable outcomes divided by the possible outcomes. So if I have 20 different combinations and I'm looking for 5 of them, the probability would be 5 out of 20, or roughly 25%, right? So this is favorable outcomes, what I'm looking for over all of the different combinations there are. And your last question, what is a sample space? A sample space is when I did a table, and I was to go, let's go heads and tails, and I was to go heads and tails. Your sample space is really an organization of all the different combinations there are. So in this particular sample space, there are 4 combinations, and I could rewrite those as being heads, 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 tails, tails, heads, or tails, tails. So technically, this is your sample space, but when you have two independent events like flipping a coin and flipping another coin, the sample space is really created in the middle of it. So a sample space is just a way to organize all of your possible outcomes. Okay, your next 9 questions are all review of previously learned material. So if you want to try these again, press pause and try them out and see how well you do. The first question says, it was $26.40 for 8 burgers. How much would it be for 9 burgers? And I could have actually used a variable up here. which probably would have been a little bit more mathematical, but I used a question mark. So there's two ways you can do it. The first way you can do it is see how much it was for one burger. So I could divide both by 8, and I would get what's called a unit rate, right? How much it is for one. So if I take my 26.40 and divide it by 8, I figure out that it's $3.30 for one burger, which means for 9 burgers, if I was to multiply that by 9, so $3.30 multiplied by 9 would mean it's $29.70 for 9 burgers. And that's one way to do it. It's called the unit rate method. My favorite method is the algebraic method. So if I take that 26.40, I'll just write it again, over 8, and it says equals x over 9, we learned that when solving proportion, or when using proportional reasoning, if we multiply across the equal sign to create one side of an algebraic equation, and then multiply the other way to get the other side of the algebraic equation, so 26.40 multiplied by 9 is 237.6. So now I've created an algebraic equation. If I wanted to solve it, I just have just one step. And if I isolated it by dividing both sides by 8, take my calculator up here again, so 237.6 divided by 8 equals, x would equal 29.7, or $29.70, which is the answer I got using the unit rate method. But I like using it because it really makes less work for you, because it works every time, and it just makes less computations. It says, without using a calculator, estimate x. So this is a Pythagoras question. So two ways you can do it. You can write your formula, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Your a and your b are always the legs, or those two sides of a right triangle that make up your 90-degree angle. So 4 squared plus that 7 squared has to equal x squared, or c squared, the hypotenuse. 4 squared is not 8, it's 16. And when I work this out, I get 65, I think, equals x squared. And isolate the variable. If you square root x squared, you'll get x. Whatever you do to one side, if you do it to the other. So the square root of 65, without a calculator, we can use this number line. And since I know the square root of 64 is a perfect square, which is 8, the square root of 81 is 9, the square root of 65 is pretty close in proximity to 8, which means it's probably 8.1-ish, or maybe even smaller, but approximately 8.1. Now, alternatively, you could have just drawn those squares onto it and did the exact same thing I was doing over here. Put that 65, and then you go from there to here, and you say x is approximately 8.1 meters. Surface area of a cylinder. Well, the easiest way to find the surface area, there's two ways to do it. You could draw the net first, if you wanted to. So the net would be 2 circles, and this side that makes a rectangle when you cut it open and fold it down. So this would be a pi r squared, and this would be a pi r squared. And what we learned was this distance here, the length of that rectangle, is the exact same measurement as the circumference of the circle. So therefore, circumference is equal to pi d. So this length is really the circumference, or is really pi d. And this measurement here is really the same measurement as this measurement here, which makes it the height. So the formula for that rectangle would actually pi d times h is your formula. So when I put all this together, I have 2 circles, which would be 2 pi r squareds, and I have a pi dh, which would be the area of that rectangle. Substitute everything I have in here. Since I don't need to be exact, I'm just going to use 3 for the pi. The radius is 10 pi. The radius is 10, so the diameter is 20, and the height is 12. This would be 6 times 100, or 600, which would be the area of 2 circles, each circle having an area of 300. And this would be 60 times 12, which is 720. When you put those both together, you get 1,320 square meters of surface that covers that cylinder. Okay, and that's the answer for that question. Your next question gives you a very poorly drawn triangular prism. It says, what is the volume of this? So volume of any right prism is the same formula. It's the area of the base times the height of the prism. So this base, this shape here is really the same as down there. So the base is really a triangle on a triangular prism. So the formula for that is base times height divided by 2. There's not two of them because we're not calculating surface area, we're just calculating volume. So that's going to be the area of the base. And if I multiply that by the height, I can think of it as every floor has a certain number of cubic units. And with 11 there, I multiply that by the height, which is 11, and substitute my data. So the base here, this is the base of the triangle, the area of that triangle. So that's 10. The height of the triangle is the perpendicular distance. And some people get it confused with this one here. That height's different. That's the height of the, sorry, that should be a capital H. That's the height of the overall prism. So the height of the triangle is really 5, and the height of the prism, which is that other H, is 11. So this is 50 divided by 2, which is 25, and 25 times 11. Well, 25 times 10 is 250, so 25 times 11 would be 25 more, which is 275 cubic meters of volume. We're not dealing with surface area, we're dealing with volume, so your units are cubic units. Next question gives you a little table with fractions, decimals, and percents. It says, what is 0.5% as a fraction and as a decimal? Well, 0.5% as a bad fraction would be this, because percentages are out of 100. And as a good fraction, it would be this. And as a lowest term fraction, it would be this. But this is really the one we wanted you to be able to write, because with that, because that's 5,000ths, tenths, hundredths, thousandths, I can then convert it properly into decimal form. So these are the two answers I really wanted. And probably if you had this, then you really know what's going on, because you realize that 5,000ths is not lowest terms. The next one says 1 and 800ths. 1 and 800ths. So 1 and 800ths would look like this as a fraction, which is acceptable. It's also 108 hundredths as a mixed fraction, and it's also 1 and 4/25ths as a lowest term fraction. But of all these three, this one here is the most important for my next step, because percentages are fractions out of 100, and 108 hundredths is 108%. And finally, 3/24ths, what is it as a decimal? So there's two ways you can do it. You can reduce the lowest terms in hopes that you know what that is as a decimal. I happen to know that 1/8 is 12.5%, but let's pretend you didn't. So the easiest way is to take your numerator, 3, and divide it by your denominator, 24, and you get 0.125 as a decimal, which is 125 thousandths, which is 12.5 hundredths, which is 12.5%. 1/8. Your next question is just a BEDMAS question using integers. So another way to write this, I saw a student write this and I was like, you know what, that's a great way to start, because I had mentioned it before and they really liked it. So if I think about that numerator as being something in brackets, the black and the red are the exact same question. The red just looks easier for people to solve. So in those brackets, if I do this first, it just means solve the numerator first before you divide that answer by -2 is what it really means. But I'm going to solve it here. So -6, take away the product of -10 and -3, which is -30. Notice how this didn't change at all. Oh, shoot. Then that is going to be keep, flip, change. I got 6 negatives and 30 positives, which is 24. Now, if you didn't want to change it, you don't like that keep, flip, change, that's good. A lot of people don't. If you have 6 negatives and I take away 30 negatives from you, not only do I take away the 6 negatives for you, but I give you 24 more positives. That makes sense. So the answer is still 24. Or if you owe $6 and your grandmother takes away $30 worth of debt, not only does it take away the $6 worth of debt, but she gives you a credit of 24 for future debt. It's another way to think about it. And if I then have this last statement, 24 divided by -2, well, 24 divided by 2 is 12. A positive divided by a negative is a negative, and therefore your answer is -12. Your next question is a table, and it asks, what is the y value when x is 100? So what I really need to do is discover what the equation that shows the relationship between x and y is. and we have good experience with that. We know how to create the equation. The difference in the y column is it goes down by 4 each time, and the difference in the x column is it goes up by 2 each time. And we learned that the coefficient of your equation, or the slope of your line, is the difference in the y column by the difference in the x column, which would be a -2. So that -2 is really going to be the coefficient in my equation. And once I know that, I'm going to write my -2 times x, but I'm going to take the first ordered pair, in this case these two here. X is going to be 2, and y is going to be -10. I'm going to simplify and see if they're equal. And they're not. -4 does not equal -10, which means I need this balancer called a constant. So -4 take away 6 will balance those two sides, which means this equation will show the relationship for every single one of these pairs in this equation. And because it's true, this one here, if I substitute 100 into this equation, if I substitute 100 in there, I have -200 minus 6 equals y. I'd have -206 equals y, and I've solved for what the missing value of y is if x is 100. Okay, this is a linear relation. So if I was to graph these points on my Cartesian plane, it would form a straight line. I have no idea what it would look like, but something like that. Your next question is an algebra, and it gives you a hint. Yes, the x is a decimal or a fraction, because some of you still think you can't have decimals or fractions as y values. So there's two ways to do this question, and I'll do them both ways for you. The first way to do it is to expand. So this is distributive property, which means -5 groups of x minus 2. You have to multiply everything in the brackets by that -5. So -5 times x is -5x, and -5 times a -2 is a +10. Some people always put that -10 by mistake. But a -5 times a -2 is +10. Now you have a two-step algebraic equation, which we all know how to isolate by now, hopefully, if we want to have any success in grade 9 and 10. We have -36, and we have to divide both sides by the coefficient. And we end up with a solution, x equals whatever 36 divided by 5 is. So take your calculator, even though I know the answer. 36 divided by 5 is 7.2. And it will be a positive 7.2, so you can have it like this. Or 7 1/5, which is what decimal 2 is. So that's one way to do it, is to expand using distributive property. This is expanding using distributive property. The other way is if you have -5 groups of x minus 2, dividing this side by -5 and dividing this side by -5 gives you one group of x minus 2. And this would be 6 decimal 2. Sorry, 5 decimal 2. See, I can't do my math here. 5 decimal 2. Once you have that, you can add 2 to both sides to get rid of your constant, and x will equal 7.2 or 7 1/5. Same answer as the other way, but it's just using division to get your answer instead of expanding. The next question is 25 1/10% of $240. It says without, then with a calculator. So 50% we know mentally is half, which is $120. And 25% is half of that, which is $60. So right now I know 25%. Now 10%, 1%, and 1/10% are all just moving the decimal. So 10% would be $24, 1% would be $2.40, and decimal 1% would be 24 cents. So since this and this equal this, then this and this must equal the answer, which is $60.24 is 25 1/10%. Now, alternatively, 25 1/10% is the same thing as 25 1/10%, which is the same thing as 25 1/10%, which is the same thing as 251 thousandths. Now, if that didn't make sense, just take a look at that pathway again. It's pretty simple to think about. And once you have that, then the final thing you need to really be able to write is that this and this are the same thing. And simply to get the percentage of it, you multiply it out, which means, oh, that's not right. 251 thousandths multiplied by the $240, or 251 thousandths of 240 is still the same answer of $60.24. with calculator and without a calculator. And that's it. That's your review in a nutshell. So hopefully everybody did okay in that review. And your probability test is tomorrow.